very interesting and exciting program that we've got. The idea behind memorialisation as a topic was suggested by the fact that we've just come through commemorations of the Great War over the last few years, and it was pointed out that the cenotaph, the actual monument, that this extraordinary memorial that was kind of invented really, was dedicated in 1919, and that this would be a fitting centenary. So that was the sort of context and the idea of the program. We have three speakers. I don't want to waste any more of your time, so I'll start by asking Judith Mossman to introduce our first speaker, Jon Hesk.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Tim. Well, when I first met Jon, he knows what's coming. He was wearing a suit and a nervous grin, and he was being interviewed for a place at Corpus Christi College, Oxford. My role in the interview was to smile nervously while a more senior scholar asked a lot of very difficult questions. And little did Jon know that his exam had been so good that there was absolutely no way, short of insulting us both or behaving very badly indeed, that he wasn't going to get in. But when being grilled on the publication dates of various books of Propertus, well, it probably was rather mean, and nobody would do it these days of sound mind. However, the ordeal was over eventually, and he came through it very well. He was an ornament to that fine institution. He is an ornament now to an even more venerable institution, the University of St Andrews, and he has written widely on Greek rhetoric and in various different modes, not just funeral speeches, which is what he's going to talk to us today, but also the wonderful trope of, unaccustomed as I am to public speaking, the sort of naive speaker in Athenian rhetoric. So I am not unaccustomed to public speaking, but I'm now going to stop doing it and let him get on with it. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much for that. Well, thank you for that introduction. I always forget about that first meeting, Judith, until you remind me. You were a benign face in that occasion, as you are today as well. So, thank you very much. And before I start, there is a handout. I did 50 copies, and I didn't imagine there'd be even more than that here. I think there are, possibly, I'm not sure. But you should be able to get sight of it. It's not essential to look at the handout anyway, because everything is here, but there's some Greek, some of the texts I'm talking about are on there with the Greek. Anyway, I must get on, because I've got half an hour. I timed my talk to 31 minutes, so if we get to half an hour and I still haven't finished, don't worry, it stops very suddenly. I kind of stop dead, like an Athenian cavalryman being shot off his horse by a Persian archer, just bang like that, okay? So if it gets to half an hour and I'm still going strong, I will suddenly stop. Great, so as we've just heard, the lecture panel's theme of memorialisation was inspired by the centenary of the cenotaph's construction in Whitehall. And although my talk is going to focus on memorialisation in classical Athens, I think the history and impact of the Whitehall cenotaph offers helpful points of comparison, but also of profound contrast and difference. And this is true because of its place in official ceremony, its status as an inspiration for thousands of similar monuments from the 1920s onwards, its immediate success as a focus for personal grief, and less well known as a focus for political anger and activism. So my lecture will occasionally toggle between the classical material and the extraordinary life story of Edward Lutyens' monument and the ceremonies which it spawned across Britain and other monuments as well, of course, and throughout Britain's empire. Now, Lutyens' deliberately austere monument gets away from a neoclassical style in many ways. I was told yesterday that the British School of Rome was designed by Lutyens. I don't know if that's true, and that's much more neoclassical. But it is, nevertheless, the cenotaph is still influenced by classical architecture, and of course the whole idea of a kenotaphion, an empty tomb, goes back to hero cults and ancestor worship in archaic Greece. Indeed, there was a military cenotaph in the public cemetery, the Demosion Sema, in the Kerameikos in classical Athens. This seems to have commemorated and listed the 192 Athenians who died at Marathon and who were interred there on the battlefield rather than having their ashes brought back home and buried, as per the usual practice in Athens. And actually, today I was reading my old school magazine where they celebrated the 100th anniversary of the Great War. And in terms of scale of the Great War, 192 dying in Marathon, at my school alone, just my little minor public school, 201 ex-boys died in the Great War. So that really gives you a sense of the difference in scale, if you like. Now, anyway, about this monument, there's a lot of disagreement and uncertainty around it, and I can't get into that here. And in any case, we have to be aware of simplistic comparisons with 20th and 21st century practice. See, I think, an excellent chapter by Polly Lowe on this. As she says there, the most important war memorials of classical Athens, unlike most contemporary societies, were not, I suggest, the tombs of the war dead, but rather those monuments which commemorated and celebrated military victory. Polly's point here is that when remembering past conflicts and sacrifices, the Athenians tended to refer to monuments to victory and dedications outside Athens' public cemetery, rather than tombs and casualty lists within. And I've given you one example here. Aeschines referring to the painting of the Battle of Marathon in the Stoa Poikile in the Athenian Agora. As usual, parallels between the ancient and the modern are partial and compromised. Having said this, there are some similarities to the Marathon monument. The Whitehall cenotaph and all the local and overseas memorials which it inspired were about creating a focus for grief and remembrance after the Great War, because the bodies of British and Imperial troops were not repatriated. Hence all of those cemeteries in Belgium and France and elsewhere. Most of the families of the dead just couldn't dream of affording to visit these overseas graves. And then, of course, there were all those soldiers, airmen, and especially sailors whose bodies were never found or recovered for proper burial. This is my great-granddad, Peter Ferguson, Stoker First Class Royal Fleet Reserve. He was killed along with 523 other souls on the 15th of October 1914 when his ship HMS Hawke was torpedoed off the coast of Aberdeen. It sank within 8 minutes, and his remains are still down there, and his name is recorded on the Chatham Memorial, and also on a memorial in Skipton. There's a whole sad story attached to my great-grandfather, but I won't go into that now. Perhaps in questions I can bring it up. But of course, unlike the Marathon one in the Kerameikos, the cenotaph in Whitehall was never about a specific battle in the Great War, and it does not have epigrams or casualty lists set upon it. It is just inscribed with the words, "The glorious dead," and the dates of the 2 world wars. Furthermore, the Armistice Day and Remembrance Sunday ceremonies, which evolved around it, are very different in character to the so-called ancestral custom, patrios nomos, of the annual Athenian funeral ceremony of the war dead. Remembrance ceremonies are not funerals. Let's now move on to the Athenian ceremony and the speeches delivered at it. And that's the Demosion Sema, the various monuments of it are sort of all along the old Academy Road here in the Kerameikos. Now, every winter in the 5th and 4th centuries BCE, on a specifically chosen day, Athenian citizens and foreigners gathered to mourn the men who had died in war. The cremated remains of the dead killed in that year lay in state for 2 days in a tent, so that relatives could make offerings. Then the remains were carried in 10 coffins organised by tribe to the Demosion Serma in the Keramikis district where they were buried. Now that lumping together of the remains by tribe is echoed by the way in which the tombs were marked with casualty lists on stelae. The casualty lists exclude personal details such as age, patronymic and deme of the dead Athenian, but they do include details which stress his place in the democratic city, notably tribal affiliation. However, note that non-Athenian allied troops are also listed, and Polyloe's point that this de-individualizing form of commemoration is found in non-Athenian, non-democratic polis. So we shouldn't overemphasize the democratizing nature of that manner of commemoration. Thucydides tells us that an 11th empty bier was conveyed for those whose bodies had not been found on the battlefield, or had not been recovered from sea, I guess. And there is a bit of Thucydides there. Among these is carried one dress, but empty bier for the missing, for the bodies not recovered. Now this makes us think of cenotaphs and tombs of unknown soldiers all over the world, from Brazil to Bangladesh. The Greek one here in Syntagma doesn't actually contain the remains of an unknown soldier, and so is actually a cenotaph. And one of its two quotations from Thucydides contains this very reference to the 11th empty bier. Anyway, after the procession of coffins, a speech was made in honour of the dead men by a man chosen by the city. A man of, quote, recognised intellectual ability and outstanding reputation, according to Thucydides. And of course, remember, he's just about to introduce Pericles' speech there. So it's not surprising he is so positive about the speaker. It was the job of the 500-strong steering council, the boule, to decide who should deliver the speech. Plato's Menexenus indicates that the debate over this could be a fraught business, and in his speech on the crown, Demosthenes gets much rhetorical capital from the fact that the council vote for him to deliver the speech at the funeral of the dead from the Battle of Chaeronea, despite there being many other worthy candidates, and of course his unworthy rival Aeschines, according to Demosthenes, that is. But it's important not to see this ceremony as constituted merely by a cortege, a big speech, and a burial. Thucydides tells us that the ceremony was a public event attended also by the female relatives of the dead men, and Isocrates claims that foreigners were there as well. Other sources report that there were musical contests, athletic games, and trials of horsemanship in honour of the dead. The war dead also received sacrifices. So this event combined burial with cult and games, two features usually reserved for the divine. The Athenian funeral orations for this ceremony, which have survived, the epitaphioi logoi, are a distinct genre of oratory. They follow a certain pattern and share certain commonplace themes. But where only a few of our large corpus of Attic law court speeches are of questionable authenticity and/or authorship, nearly all of the Athenian funeral speeches have had their authenticity questioned. Only Hypereides' funeral speech of 322 BCE, the very last example we have chronologically, is 100% certain to have been delivered at the funeral of the war dead. But today I'm not going to worry too much about questions of authorship, authenticity, and the question of whether the other speeches we have are what was actually delivered. The bottom line here, as the French scholar Nicole Leroux recognised long ago, is that these speeches offer us a unique insight into Athens' public culture and ideological mechanisms. And that remains largely true, even if they are simulations, adaptations, or reconstructions, rather than accurate transcripts. And indeed, Plato's one is a sort of parody come pastiche of a funeral speech, and we'll come back to that. But what exactly should we focus on when we think about the social and ideological role of these speeches? On the one hand, and as Leroux made us realise, these speeches are all about the iteration of key values and messages from one year to the next and from one generation to the next. That's achieved by the preservation of a traditional structure and the repetition of certain themes and motifs, all of which serve certain unchanging objectives and aims. On the other hand, it's crucial not to lose sight of the particularity of each speech. the specific context of that year's ceremony, or the military campaign whose dead it memorialises. For while this genre may be conservative, each extant speech has strikingly unique elements and distinctive emphases. These dynamics of difference and specificity are driven by a number of factors, and I mentioned just 3 of them today. First, we have the outcome of the campaigns in which the honoured dead took part. So, for example, the tone and emphasis of Demosthenes' speech is different to that of Hyperides' speech. Demosthenes is eulogising those who died during the defeat by Macedonian forces at Chaeronea. Hyperides is eulogising those who died during the first highly successful phase of the Lamian War, certainly successful from an Athenian point of view, that is. So let's have a look at these 2 next to each other. Demosthenes first. So these are the lot that died and lost, as it were. Whenever a battle takes place, one side must win and the other must lose. However, I would not hesitate to say that I think that those who die at their posts on either side do not share in defeat, but are equally victorious on both sides. Every man in battle has done what he ought to do to achieve this end. His opponents did not defeat him in spirit. And then a little later, if there was any one person who might be blamed for the outcome of that battle, one might reasonably accuse the Thebans in charge of their army. And then we've got Hyperides, so this lot were winning at this point. The battle that took place near Thermopylae and Lamia proved to be no less glorious for them than that which they fought in Boeotia. None of those who came before ever fought for more noble goals or against stronger adversaries, or with fewer allies, judging that virtue, arete, was a form of strength, and courage, Andrea, was a form of superiority, rather than a matter of numbers of bodies. So I hope you can see here how Demosthenes is having to work hard to minimise the negative implications of the Greek defeat, and Athens' part in that. When it comes to the dead, he says, everyone's a winner in a sense. And as for why we lost to the Macedonians, well, if we have to point fingers, it was the fault of the Theban officer class and their bad leadership. And I wish I had time to show you more of this. Demosthenes has a deft line on turning the peace which Athens negotiated with Philip into a sure sign that the courage of the fallen Athenians had scared the king away from the invasion of Attica. Meanwhile, Hyperides can parlay an Athenian victory into a claim that the dead men in front of him have surpassed the accomplishments of all Athenian warriors in all previous years since the dawn of time, basically. Again, what you have here is not even the half of it. By the end of the speech, Hyperides is arguing that these men and their slain general have performed feats more impressive than the Greeks at Troy and the Athenians at Marathon and Salamis. And the mode here is really interesting. He's persuading his audience that they must remember these men just as much as the heroes of the Trojan and Persian wars. Secondly, it's clear that the orator is expected to say some new and unprecedented things, while at the same time sticking to a traditional framework. Not to do so would be to risk a deficit of recognition and praise for the freshest crop of dead warriors. Now, I base this claim not just on the fact that each speech has something different about it, but on the fact that the speaker sometimes self-presents himself as a tweaker to the tradition, rather than a mere copyist. Given that we have the tiniest sample of the genre, it's hard to know how new or distinctive each speech really is, but it's often overlooked how far each orator inserts his own voice and approach into these speeches. Now, I don't have time to take you through the examples of this that I've got on my handouts and up here, but I hope that you can see what I'm talking about, and you can always quiz me on it right at the end of our 3 talks. My third point, thirdly, the speaker chosen was clearly often a politician and or general who has been singly or jointly an architect of the particular war or campaign in question. This is true of Demosthenes and Chaeronea, Hyperides and the Lamian War, and of course Pericles with the Samos campaign and the Archidanian War. When you read these speeches, knowing that the speaker is at least partially responsible for the deaths of the men he is eulogising, then the importance of imagining these orations in their original live context becomes crucial. The testimony of Plutarch in his 5th century sources shows that the speaker may sometimes even have been called out on his involvement in the campaign which killed the audience's sons, brothers, husbands and fathers. And this refers to Pericles' funeral speech delivered in 439 over those who had died in the costly campaign against Samos. So this isn't the one that's in Thucydides, this is an earlier one. Okay? For the oration which he made, so this is talking about Pericles' speech, according to the custom over their tombs, he won the greatest admiration. But as he came down from the platform, while the rest of the women clasped his hand and fastened wreaths and bands on his head, as if he were some victorious athlete, Elpinike came close and said, "This is admirable of you, Pericles, and deserving of wreaths, in that you have lost us many brave citizens, not in a war with Phoenicians or Medes, like my brother Cimon, but in the subversion of an allied and kindred city." So what Elpinike, Cimon's sister, is saying here is, my brother fought the barbarians, fought off this invasion. We used Greeks. Greeks died against the barbarians, but you've killed our own side in a war against other Greeks. So what's so great about that? Now, Pericles has a riposte. He's very rude to Elpinike, according to Plutarch and 5th century sources, and he quotes from Archilochus. I haven't got time to go into that, talk about it later if you like. And of course, possibly this story is possibly apocryphal. I don't personally think it is. In any case, scholars like Lorna Hardwick have adduced other evidence that upper-class women present at the funeral ceremony may have given voice to their support or their unhappiness in what Lorna calls the highly charged atmosphere of such occasions. Now, when we think about this anecdote, we get a sense of how each year's funeral ceremony and speech could have been very distinctive in terms of how things played out in the moment. And to toggle back to the modern context for a moment, this is also true of the UK's Armistice Day and Remembrance Day ceremonies. In the 21st century, these occasions are quiet, dignified affairs which do not have politicians or generals giving speeches. In fact, they are marked by a brief exhortation and silence for 2 minutes. Silence. Those last 2 lines, by the way, are an adaptation of Simonides. Just a sidebar there. Now, no modern-day Elpinike rushing up to harangue Tony Blair as he lays a wreath then. But in the 1920s, it was very different. Cenotaphs, memorials, and our annual Armistice Day ceremonies had barely taken root before they experienced disruption and protest. In Liverpool and Dundee in 1921, things got violent as thousands of the unemployed, many of them veterans of the Great War, marched on the Armistice Day gatherings. In Whitehall, the protest was massive, but more peaceful. So you had 25,000 London area unemployed, many of them veterans, and as this eyewitness recalls, they put their medals on banners, and then they brought out pawnbroker tickets and pinned them to their lapels. Okay? Thousands of ex-servicemen took pawn tickets from their pockets, that's that bit. At the head of the procession was carried a large wreath with an inscription that read, "From the living victims, the unemployed, to our dead comrades who died in vain." So very, very powerful occasion. Now, I'm not suggesting that anything as radical as this took place at the epitaphic ceremonies in Athens. But if we take a comedy like Lysistrata, it's clear that it was possible for relatives to think dissenting thoughts about the Peloponnesian Wars. And it's in the context of needing to manage, answer and neutralise the questioning and discontent which such losses must have provoked in relatives that we should view the structure, themes and explicitly stated functions of the funeral orations. So, I'm not going to belabor this, we always have a prologue with references to earlier speeches and the difficulty and possibility even of praising the dead adequately, extended praise not just for the war dead but for the ancestors and past campaigns, and then, and sometimes of course the city of Athens at large, particularly in the Thucydidean version. section of consolation, paramuthia, and an epilogue stressing that the dead are blessed through their distinction and virtue, and sometimes an instruction to depart now that rites have been performed. As for aims and functions, one can go to Plato's Menexenus to see what was expected. This is from the prologue of Socrates' funeral speech, or rather the speech which he supposedly memorised from Aspasia, the courtesan, who supposedly kind of wrote the funeral speeches for Pericles, according to Plato and Socrates. For it is by means of a speech finely spoken that deeds nobly done gain memorial, nermer and renown, for their doers, in the ears of those who are listening. And the speech required is one which will adequately eulogise the dead and give gentle exhortation to the living, appealing to their children and their brethren to copy the virtues of these heroes, and to their fathers and mothers, and to any still surviving older relatives, then offering them consolation. Here we see immediately three of the four functions of my title: commemoration, exhortation, and glorification. And this is especially true when we recognise that positive praise of the dead is both a mechanism of commemoration and a means of conferring everlasting glory and renown on them. If I had more time, I'd take you through the speeches to show you all the exhorting and glorifying in detail. But given that we're focused on memorialisation this evening, I ought to linger a little on commemoration. It's worth stressing how important these speeches were in the construction and transmission of collective memory as a means of creating and maintaining an idea of community and belonging to be preserved at all costs. Julia Shear puts it well in a brilliant article, CQ article. The first passage from her here sums up the findings of historical and social scientific work actually on modern modes of community commemoration. When a group remembers as a part of a ritual, a memory is created both of the act of remembering and the event being remembered. Without the rituals, these memories would not otherwise be available to the participants. In this way, the group is presented to itself and its shared values are disseminated. So ritual is really important here. Since the whole group participates in this process, a national memory is created and it's manifested both in rituals and in commemorative monuments. This collective remembrance also serves to unify the group and to bind its members together. These dynamics are extremely powerful, and although they have been most discussed in the context of the modern world, they are also very much applicable to classical Athens. And then she says this very eloquently about the funeral orations in particular. The deeds mentioned were chosen out of a large and potential corpus to construct a particular image of Athens as the democratic city victorious in war against external enemies. This process involves selection, remembering some things while others were left out and so forgotten. Memory is consequently also at stake in these speeches, and we need to ask how these dynamics worked. The speakers themselves recognise the important role which remembrance played, and they're clear that their oration's function was to create memories of the war dead among the living. Now, to simplify a little, each speech does two types of this memory work. First, the orator selects examples of Athens' past glorious military exploits, which have clearly become touchstones of the city's official history and idea of itself. For example, Lysias' speech recounts how King Theseus' Athenians prosecuted a just war to retrieve the unburied bodies of the Argives who had marched with Polynices on Thebes. The Thebans had refused to give back the corpses or bury them. And here's what Lysias says about that. Thinking it right that those who had died in the war should receive the customary treatment, they risked combat with one of the parties in the interest of both, that is, both the Thebans and the Argives. That on one side, that's the Thebans, they should cease from grossly outraging the gods by their trespass against the dead, and then on the other, they should not hasten away to their own land, frustrated of an ancestral honour, cut off from the Hellenic custom, and disappointed in a common hope. So here we see the Athenians, actually helping their enemies not to be impious in the long run, as well as their new allies, the Argives. Now this is clearly about reminding the audience and educating the young, something which Euripides' Adrastus explicitly refers to in his complicated, difficult to interpret funeral speech. But the second type of memory work is to insert the dead of the current year's campaigning into this remembered narrative of self-sacrifice and valour, even where the orator does not dwell that much on that year's exploits, and Thucydides' Pericles is a famous example of that. Even in that case, the implication is clear. The men before us are now to be remembered alongside the men who fought with Theseus, or Miltiades, or Themistocles. But to return to Plato's lists of aims or functions, you'll see that there's a fourth function in Socrates' speech here, paramouthia, consolation of the living relatives of the fallen. Now, I haven't listed consolation as a feature of the speeches in the title of this lecture. I've listed justification instead. And why have I done this? Well, I certainly don't want to deny that there is a consoling element which comes at the end of these speeches. It's there at the end of every single one of them, although the texture and tone varies greatly, despite the presence of similar ideas. So, for example, Pericles is quite upbeat and brisk with his tactics of consolation. He tells listening relatives that amidst all the uncertainties and vicissitudes of mortal life, it's actually a matter of good fortune that their kinsmen have died so bravely and gloriously. Lysias is much darker about grief, and this creates a very different tone and texture to his closing consolatory section. And I'll just give you the opening bit of that. For what woe could be more incurable than to bring forth and rear and bury one's own children, and then in old age to be disabled in body and having lost every hope to find oneself friendless and resourceless. And so it goes on into even greater depths of misery, basically, thinking about surviving relatives. Okay, it's grim stuff. But Lysias turns this around by stressing that the surviving relatives must be helped, supported and honoured by the community. And he goes on, in the end, to rehearse the traditional trope of consolation. It's fitting to consider those most happy who have closed their lives in risking them for the greatest and noblest ends, not committing their career to chance, nor awaiting the death that comes of itself, but selecting the fairest one of all. I say their memory can never grow old, while their honour is every man's envy. And we're familiar with that trope, aren't we? Their memory will never grow old. We still have that as part of our ceremonies. Now, I think this consolatory rhetoric found in all the speeches seeks to justify military death too, as well as console the mourning relatives. The argument is that the dead were given and took a unique opportunity to attain a quasi-divine status of honour and fame. Only war in defence of the city and its interests can provide that opportunity. So these tropes of consolation do need to be seen alongside the many instances where the funeral orations stress that the dead have sacrificed themselves in the face of existential threats to the city of Athens. And I leave you with one of those powerful, seductive moments of justification. This is Hypereides. Now, it's worthwhile to consider also what we suppose would have happened if they had not fought dutifully. Wouldn't the whole world be subject to one master, of course, Philip of Macedon, and wouldn't Greece be forced to treat his whim as law? In short, the insolence, hyperphania, and not the power of justice would prevail everywhere. Thank you very much for your attention.